Hi, my name is Sheila, and this is my channel, Seaside Snuggles, Quilts, Patterns, and Crafts, where I focus mainly on quilting, but will craft whatever is tickling my fancy. So, what's been tickling my fancy for about 2 months now, it feels like, is the Scrappy Arabesque quilt. This pattern is in my store on Etsy, which I will link down below. In a previous video, we put together the center part of the quilt here. And in this video, we're going to work on, I don't know if you can see, the lattice border. And I know you can't see the border at the top, but I will pop up a full image of this quilt. We're going to work on both these borders to finish this quilt up. When it's finished, it will measure 72 inches by 102 inches, which is a twin XL size or a nice large throw. So, as I stated before, I'm using Gotham Grey for my background pieces of Kona cotton, and this is Roar by Free Spirit, well, by Tula Pink, made by Free Spirit. So I don't know what more to say. I'm sure you want to get onto these borders that you can use on any quilt that you like. So even though this video is a second part, you can use this as a standalone to add borders to your own quilt, whatever the design. You can adjust these for whatever size, baby quilt through king size quilt if you like, and this video is going to show you how. I hope you will join me. Let's get started. We're going to start with the lattice border for the Scrappy Arabesque quilt. I will leave a link in the description below for the pattern if you're interested. You don't need to watch the first video, but this is the second part of a two-part series for this quilt. Of course, you could use these borders on any quilt you like. So I'm starting by showing you the scrap that I had left after making the center of the quilt using the arabesque blocks. And we're going to cut some pieces from the pattern. If you look on page 9, there is a cutting diagram, and it shows pieces K, M, and then on the next page, L and N, which will be your background pieces. Here we are cutting pieces K and N, just a single strip of each. K is 1 3/4 inches and M is 2 1/4 inches. L and N will be cut from background fabric. They'll be 1 1/8 inch wide. L will be 10 inches wide and N will be 5 inches wide. We'll use those later, so remember that. And you can go ahead and turn to page 20 and you'll see the instructions we're about to work. If you're using directional fabric, you need to be specific in the way that you cut them. Turn the fabric so that it is right side up, and in that position you want to cut from the bottom left to the top right. When we put our segments together for the lattice, that top triangle will be at the bottom of the segment and the bottom triangle will be at the top of the segment. So keep your pairs together. Organization is still the key in this case. So there I was just showing that if it's not directional, it doesn't matter. You can cut it either way. So now this is the K strip, and to the K strip, we want to sew 2 L pieces. I just cut them roughly 10 inches since I'm using half of the fat quarter that we had cut before, which was 10 inches. Next, we're going to take 2 of the 10-inch background pieces and sew them to the long edges of piece K. And I'm just doing a small section here with 4 different fabrics as a demonstration, but you'll have to do this many times over. Once you get all the background pieces sewn onto your K pieces, whatever amount you're doing, you want to press these in a specific way. So you're going to press one background piece towards the background piece and the other background piece away from the background piece, so that if you turn it over, all the seam allowance will be going in the same direction. We're building that channel and key type of alignment, so this is what we're going for on the back of our sections, with the seam allowances open for one section and closed for the other section. We're cutting these down to 1 3/4 inches, and we're going to start adding our triangles. So remember, when we cut our triangles, we cut them from the bottom left to the top right. We're going to take that bottom right triangle and put it at the top, and the bottom left, or the top left triangle, and put it on the bottom, lining up the straight edges. Once you get things laid out, I just flip my tops over and I sew with the segmented piece up. The 90-degree angles are right on top of each other. The little triangle is pointed towards me, and you sew both sides that way. Make sure that you stay consistent so that you don't have some pieces in two different directions, because they're going to be at an angle in your lattice. Now, once we cut these apart, we have both triangles on. You're going to reference the back, and if the seam allowance is away from the background on one side, you want to press it away from the background on the other side. If it's towards the background, then press the opposite edge towards the background as well. We're forming that channel and the key so that we can line our pieces up correctly when we're putting the lattice together. See there? Now, the next thing we're going to sew on after we cut our dog ears off is the 5-inch pieces of background fabric. And we're going to place those with the open seam allowance at the top, and we're going to line up the raw edge of the open seam allowance with the top edge of the 5-inch piece of background. Now, it should kind of line up at the bottom with the point, but that is not the important thing. The important thing is that you line up those two raw edges at the top of the seam so that all of those 5-inch pieces are on the same side of the segment, and so that their positioning will be correct for the lattice. Otherwise, you'll end up cutting off some of the background piece when you trim your lattice down. And this is just to show you that I've also used in my scrap the pieces of fabric that I opted not to use in the main body. And it's easy enough to cut these pieces to size. So this section is actually 2 inches wide. So we can cut our 1 3/4 inch pieces from this. We're going to start by cutting that background fabric, the feature fabric off. Now, with two raw edges, the size you're going to cut that is 1 3/4. But from the seam, you're going to cut it 1 1/2 inches. And then the background piece is going to be cut down to 7/8 inch from the seam for the 1 1/8 inch piece. Once I get those pieces sewn on, I'm going to do the same thing I did before with the seam allowance direction. 1 seam allowance towards the background, 1 seam allowance away from the background, and then I'll trim it down to 1 3/4 inches wide, and then it'll be just like the other pieces that we cut from strips. For the triangles, they're going to be bigger than the triangles we used before, but that's fine. You still want to line them up the same way with the straight edge like that, so the slope is kind of going up and to the right. Here I was trying to decide which way I wanted that face to be, but really the pieces are so small, it really doesn't make too much a difference, but it's something you'll want to pay attention to. I cut that piece down to the normal size, which would have been the M size, which is 2 1/4 inches, because I wanted to keep most of the flowers in that piece. But again, the segmented section is on top of the triangle. the 90-degree angles match and the triangle is pointing towards you. If the seam allowance is away from the background piece, press the other side away. If it's toward the background piece, press the other side in the same direction. Then you can trim these down. But because the triangles are so big, they're going to be longer than the other segments. It won't matter because of the way these are going to be lined up. So you do want to trim your dog ears off. And because these dog ears are so large, I'm using my ruler and I'm cutting it down to 1 3/4 inches width, like the other pieces. Now I'm going to sew on my 5-inch piece. And again, you want to line it up with the raw edge of that other background piece with the seam allowances open. That's why it doesn't matter that those triangles are larger. Then you're going to press all the 5-inch pieces towards the background. And now they're ready to be used. So this is how they're going to be lined up. And you want to take some time to organize your pieces. If you're doing a scrappy version like this, then you want to make sure that you get a good distribution of fabrics. And if you have like only a few pieces, make sure that you got 4 sides that you're going to be building. So you don't want to get all of the same fabric in the same side of the quilt, if that matters to you. For the rainbow quilt, I did a gradient, so that was actually a little bit easier. See how these are going to line up? It's just like our X's in the center part of the quilt. So you're going to nest the seams that are together within the seams that are apart. You want to pin it right where that 5-inch bar meets, where it's perpendicular. And I just pin a ton of these like this. I get everything aligned. I make sure that the edges are aligned, that the pieces of the lattice are nested, and then I pin a bunch of them at a time out of the path of my presser foot, and then I can go for a long time just pairing these up. After I get these pairs sewn, I'll pair them. All the seam allowances are going to go towards the background pieces for these 5-inch background pieces. So they'll all be facing towards the background piece as we join the segments together. So here we are, same as with 2. You want to nest those seam allowances, pin it right where the crossbar is, and you can do several of those at a time. Get yourself a good chain going and just go to town. So we're just going to continue this way, pairing them up and growing our lattices. I work 4 at a time, so I keep, how do I want to say this? Oh, if you get 2 of the background pieces together, you just need to rotate your lattice. But I try to grow 4 strings of lattice, 1 for the top, 1 for the bottom, 1 for the left, for the right. Once I have 4 pieces of lattice that are long enough to go across the top and the bottom, then I separate those 2 and I continue growing the side pieces because they're going to be a little bit longer. After I get them mostly together, it's time to trim them down to size. And so the cut size of our lattice is going to be 3 inches, measured from center. You don't want to cut here. This is just to show what your center line is going to be. You're going to take all of those intersections and line them up, and that's going to be your center. Then you're going to measure 1.5 inches from that center line, using the 45-degree angle as well to keep yourself straight here. And then you're going to cut. So 1.5 inches from the center line is where you're going to cut. You don't want to cut all the way across because sometimes your lineup isn't quite right. So give yourself a little buffer space there. And I just kind of veer up and away from the lattice so that I don't accidentally cut too much. You definitely don't want to cut beyond your 2 points at the left and the right extremes because, you may throw yourself off a little bit. But just take your time and make sure that first 1.5 inches is accurate, and then when you do your second 1.5 inches, you're just actually going to measure 3 inches from the bottom to square up your lattice. So make sure your first cuts are correct, and then you can just measure 3 inches from the bottom. From this point, the lattice is going to be framed with strips I and O. They each measure 1 5/8 inches, but we're not going to sew those to the lattice. We're going to be sewing those to the quilt first. So all we're going to do now is just rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. We're going to make our sections. We're going to sew our sections together. We're going to grow them until they are long enough to span the width of the quilt. You need 2 of those, and the length of the quilt. We need 2 of those. When you're eyeballing, estimating how long these pieces are, you want to take into account that you're going to have that inner border sewn to the quilt. So go ahead and set it a little bit away from the quilt, and it needs to extend above the top and above the bottom for the inside angles of your strips, because we're going to miter the corners. Before we miter those corners, we have a lot of segments to put together, so I will put some music on. You can watch as I put these pairs together, and then pairs to pairs and pairs to more pairs. After that, we will get to sewing the triangles together that will finish up our edges, that will allow us to get those miters. I'm having a hard time saying miters today. So we can get those mitered corners done. All right, cue the music. What did you think of my music selection? I'm experimenting. Let me know in the comments below and give me a like. Okay, so if you have the pattern, we're on page 20 now. This is where we need to make the triangles to finish up our lattice sections of the border. So I have not trimmed this down, and this is one long strip. This is a side strip. I don't have very many pieces that are directional, and honestly, I don't care if the head is to the outside or the inside, if there is directional fabric on this one, but if you do, just rotate it around, okay? Now, I do want to have all of my pieces the same going around the quilt. So if I have a piece of, well, it doesn't really matter. It honestly doesn't really matter, because we're about to make these pieces trapezoids instead of parallelograms. What matters is what direction you want the fabric to be on the side of your quilt. If you have directional fabric, if it matters to you what side the top is. All right, so for me, it doesn't really matter. So I have, these are my 2 ends, and it would work either way. But I need to make a triangle to turn this parallelogram into a trapezoid. So I'm going to work on this end, just because the triangle that I build on this end, I can change to work on the other end just by adding a background piece, a long leg onto it. So I'm going to build it like I'm building onto this piece that already has a background piece on. And I have some leftover strips, sections. I have 4, 1 for each side. So 1 for the top, 1 for the bottom, 1 for the left, 1 for the right. And, you know, 2 of them are the same. They're very similar to one another, but they're not going to be touching each other, so it doesn't really matter. If you find when you are putting this together that you don't like the way the fabrics are coming together, just change it out. Okay, maybe make an extra triangle so that you have it to change out quickly. Okay, it's not a big deal. So I'm going to use this piece because it's right there. No, there's a white one right there. But it's different enough that it's fine. And I'm going to place it beside my parallelogram just so that I can keep the continuous fabrics the same when I'm thinking about the triangle that I want to make. Once I make one, then I can use that as the template for all the rest. So my triangle needs to take up this space here to turn this into a parallelogram, to a trapezoid, where the angles go towards one another instead of being parallel to one another. So my triangle is going to be this shape. Let's use this as this solid big triangle. I need the triangle I build to look like that. Okay? Except it's going to continue the lattice pattern. So I'm going to use this piece. And I have my open seams at the bottom that will nest on top of the closed seams at the top. And I need to add a triangle there. So I just have a cut triangle of fabric that's larger than what I've been using, just because I want to have a little excess there. It's not going to line up like this. So I'm going to take this big triangle out that's my sample and show you where this is going to go. And I want to change it so that I have a bar here, but I want my end bar here to be solid because that's going to be in my corner. So what I want to take off of this is the background piece and the bottom corner. So I'm going to take my seam ripper and I'm going to take off the bottom background piece, or the piece that's up there, and along with its corner. And I'm going to set that corner aside. So now I have this. I'm going to sew this corner onto this, but I need a background piece to sew onto there. So I have my collection of scraps here, and I just want a piece of scrap that's the same width. So I'm going to sew this on, and then we'll move on to the next piece. Give that a little spritz of water. And I'm going to press this towards the background fabric, and we're going to trim it down to 7/8 of an inch. Can you see that? And then we're going to give this edge a straight edge. It's oversized, so it's fine. Then let's lay this back out so we see what we're doing. This piece is going here. This piece is going to be sewn here with this edge lined up. So let's go do that. Again, we're going to press towards the background fabric. So I'm just going to give that a finger press and then an iron. Okay, so we have our triangle here. Now we're going to sew the triangle onto our strip, and then we will sew a background piece onto there, and that will finish up our trapezoid. So let's sew this first, and we're going to do it the way we've done all the other pieces when we add them, is we're going to nest this piece right here. We're going to feel and make sure that that bottom bar is nested within the top bar. I'm going to put a pin in here, and then we're going to sew this on. We're going to press that towards the background piece. And then we're going to trim this, and we're going to sew one more piece on to finish the section. So don't worry about this being oversized.
We're going to trim this to this edge and match it up. Also check that this is a 90-degree angle here, so this is going to be lined up with your hatch marks.
Then we're going to take
another 5-inch piece, and we're going to place it on here, and we're going to finish up the edge. Brits.
And there we go. All right, so now when we look at our two opposite corners, let's see if I can pull this up here. Okay, it's now a trapezoid and not a parallelogram. You can go ahead and sew a piece on here as well, so that you have these background pieces on both ends, and then you can go ahead and trim these down to 3 inches. However, there's one more step. Well, there's actually more than one more step, but when we're sewing this onto our quilt, we may have to make adjustments. When we make our adjustments, we're going to make them along these long leg seams. So we'll stay away from the corner that we just built. You can make it anywhere else along the strip to shorten this row if you need to. If you need to make it bigger, you'll need to add an entire piece and then shorten it down to size. Okay. Unless it's really way off. So I'm going to go ahead and sew this on. After it's trimmed, after it's sized, before you sew it on, you're going to want to trim down these corners if you want a consistent size to your legs, or you can leave them as they are, but they're going to end up being about 1/4 of an inch larger than your other lines of lattice. Okay, so let's go sew this background piece onto the opposite end. If you were sewing this triangle onto this end, you would need to add the background piece that's going to connect to this first, and then close it out with your actual corner piece. Okay, so let's go sew this on. And again, this is going to be pressed to the outside. Like this. Now I don't trim these until like everything else is done except right before I attach it to the quilt. I've got it downsized and all that business, because if I change my mind or whatever, you can't put it back on. But let me show you what I'm talking about here. If these were opposite edges of corners and I were to just sew them to one another, I would lose 1/2 inch. So I'm going to overlap it by 1/4 of an inch. Is that right? No, I need to overlap it by an entire 1/2 inch. So my finished corner would be fatter than the other parts of the lattice. If I want it to be the same size, I'm going to need to trim this down. And the measurement for that trim down is 9/16 from the seam. So if you were going to trim this down to get equal lattice measurements, you would need to measure 9/16. Now I show where 9/16 is on the ruler, but I'll show you here as well. 10/16 is the same as 5/8, right? So if you were going to measure 5/8 right here, then slide back halfway between the 1/2 inch mark and the 5/8 inch mark, and that's going to give you 9/16. You would trim this amount off,
and then off of both sides of the corners, and then you should get a piece that is the same size as the rest of your lattice. Now, you might say, well, why not just cut, it looks like roughly 1/4 of an inch off of here. It's 3/16 cutting off here, but sometimes after you sew this on, this isn't straight. Your seam is where you should measure from for the 9/16. So again, you would take it to 5/8 of an inch, and then back it towards the 1/2 inch until you're halfway between, and that is 9/16 of an inch. Cut that off, cut it off here as well, 9/16 of an inch away from the stitch line. And then when you sew it together, your corner seam should be the same as the other parts of your lattice, the same width. All right, so now that we know what this corner is going to look like, we can kind of build out our other corners. I'm going to continue with my lattice borders. I'm going to sew my borders to the inside of the quilt, and then I will join you back for actually attaching these to the quilt. Remember, if you're doing mitered corners, do not sew that solid strip around the quilt to the lattice part of the quilt. Sew the solid strip all the way around the quilt, then we'll add the lattice part, and then we'll sew the second solid strip. So see you for sewing on the lattice.
After we get all 4 sides of our lattice sewn and the triangle sewn on, but before we move on, I wanted to show you one handy hack for cutting your lattices, and that is to use the longest ruler you have. In this case, I'm using my 24-inch ruler. I'm still using the 1.5 inch mark through the center to cut my first side of the lattice, and I'm making sure all of those points pass through the 1.5 inch mark. I'm also checking that that 45-degree line is passing through each of the 1 inch squares through the middle. And I am kind of veering off my blade before I get to the end of the cut so that I don't accidentally cut that last piece incorrectly. So this is at 4 times speed, by the way. So just take your time, go slowly, make sure all of your centers are at 1.5 inches, and work your way down each strip of lattice. I keep a little piece of fabric with the number on it so that I know which piece of lattice goes to which side of the quilt, because I work clockwise. And then you have that little piece of tape. I'm having my little stack piece of masking tape or painter's tape on my ruler at 3 inches, and that way I can just press it up against. See, if it's not right, I can make a little adjustment, shove my ruler up against the lattice, and then I'll be right at 3 inches after that first edge is cut. So you might give that a try. It's very helpful, and it'll let you get through this lattice very quickly. Before we sew the inner border to the quilt, we need to make sure that our quilt is rectangular. So what I do is I like to fold my quilt into 4 and then compare the sides and make sure that they are of equal length. If they're not, then I make any adjustments in the seams. So this one I had a little buckle there, and I fixed it by adjusting some of my seams on the side that was longer. So I make that comparison with the 2 sides of the quilt and the top and bottom of the quilt to make sure that they're equal. And then I cut my 1 5/8 strip of inner border, sew it together to prepare it to put on the quilt. What I want to do is I want to measure the pieces that I'm going to sew onto the quilt and make sure they are the same. And the way that I do that is that I pin it to the side of the quilt. And I don't show it here, but what I did was I actually pinned 2 strips to the side of the quilt, all the way down the quilt, and then cut 2 strips the same size. So my other side is already sewn on, and this is me pinning on the second side. But because I cut them both to the same size, I want to make sure that when I get to the end of pinning here, that it is actually at the end of my quilt
If it's not, then I need to check it and make any adjustments that are necessary so that the quilt ends where the piece ends. So see how I went to the end and then I'm just working my way back, making sure that I don't have any buckles or folds or anything so that things are the correct size. Then I sew it with the more narrow strip on top, even though I have all those seam allowances at the bottom. I just want to be careful not to let any of those seam allowances flip on me as I'm sewing. So I'm not sewing this fast. This is at 4 times speed. I'm actually sewing much more slowly than this to make sure that those seam allowances stay where I want them. Once you get the side pieces sewn on, you want to press the seam allowance to the outside and then do the same thing with the top and bottom. So I folded it in half. I used 2 strips of the background piece, measured it so that the top and bottom were equal in length, and then I sewed those on. I got ready to put my lattice pieces on. I already pinned it on here, not thinking about recording it, and so it is not sewn on. I just want to show you how I got here. 2 things are about to happen here. One, we want to make sure that we're aligning the corner correctly, and I'm just going to use a chalk pencil because I can't find my white heat pen, but use something that is narrow if you can so that you are accurate in marking a 1/4 inch from each side of your quilt and a 1/4 inch from each side of the lattice. I use the 2-pin method here to pin through the intersection where I mark the 1/4 inch on the quilt and on the lattice, and then I also marked the side that I'd be sewing on so I know where to start my needle. Then I pinned the lattice all the way down to the other end. Now, I don't know how it's going to end. I just estimated how many segment pieces that I needed, and so I can see now that it's pinned that I'm short, and it looks like I'm short 1. So I'm going to add 1 to the center, somewhere in the middle of my lattice strip, instead of adding it on the side. The reason being, I've already, well, I don't think I already trimmed this one, but in a lot of cases, I might have already trimmed that corner piece. So instead of adding it on the end where I've already trimmed that piece to size, that 9/16, I just add a piece somewhere in the middle. So we're adding this on. I think that I didn't rotate this piece correctly so that it would nest. So I just had to kind of hope and sew. You can see that the open seams are at the opposite end of all the other open seams. I should have just corrected that, but I didn't, and it turned out okay. You just had to be more careful with lining up that crossbar. Once I get that piece sewn in, I want to go back in and I want to trim the lattice down to 3 inches where I just added that piece. The second thing that's going to happen here is we're going to adjust the lattice so it fits the side of the quilt. But first, we'll have to get to the other end and get that all pinned. So let's do that. I need to mark the opposite end of the quilt and the lattice so that is 1/4 of an inch from the edges so that I know where to stop my stitches. And I'm using the 2-pin method. I'm pinning straight down through that hole and then I'm pinning across it so I don't tilt it anyway. After I get those 2 ends marked, then I'm going to pin backwards from the end of my seam until I get to where my pins are coming together. And I'm going to see if I have any excess lattice. Now, the lattice edge is all bias. So you can use the ease if you're short. If you're long, you're going to have to take some
out of your lattice. So the way I do that is you can do it two ways, is I stitch a little bit less than 1/8 of an inch up to 1/8 of an inch at random points along the lattice until it is small enough to be a good fit. Or you could remove the stitches, which I'll show you as well, and re-sew a 3/8 inch seam allowance, but line up the pieces so that your seam edge is straight. So when I sew it this way, my seam edge is not going to be straight. It's going to be kind of wonky where I made the correction. You want to make the corrections 1/8 of an inch or less so that it's not as noticeable along the length of the lattice. And if you don't get enough, I always go conservatively. And then if I don't get enough, I add a few more stitches. I choose another place and add more stitches. So this is the second way that you can do it, and that is to completely separate the lattice, pull all your threads out, press your seam flat, and then put it back together, but align it for a 3/8 inch seam allowance instead of a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and that will keep your lattice stitch line straight. The raw edge will be straight still. So you can do it either way. I usually do it the other way. It saves time because I'm not picking and getting the threads out and restitching it. I'm just folding it where it is and stitching about 1/8 of an inch in from my original seam. It's a little wonky, but that wonkiness is lost in the seam allowance when you sew the lattice to the quilt. So it's up to you. But see, I've realigned it. See, I'm stitching 1/8 of an inch to the left of my original seam allowance, but the edges are going to stay the same because I've repositioned it. So now that you know how to resize, let's get this sewn onto the quilt. I'm slowing this down to normal speed so that I can better explain how to attach these lattice pieces. I'm going to use my hand wheel to put the needle down right where I am pinned. Okay, then I'm going to lower my presser foot and I'm going to sew 2 or 3 stitches forward and then 2 or 3 stitches back, preferably the same number that I stitched forward. I can take that pin out now. And now we're just going to sew, and we're going to take our time. We're going to keep our seam allowances going in the direction that we press them in. And because I've pinned off to the side, I don't have to remove the pins as I go because they're not in my way. I'm just taking my time. Be careful not to let your seam allowances roll up on you. Make sure that you're lined up top and bottom. For some reason, I don't have very many pins right there. So if you can't see that bottom piece, make sure that you get yourself lined up. It should just be peeking out. Okay, so this is where we just sewed a second seam, and so your bottom fabric is showing a little bit more, but we're making a transition here, so use the bottom piece as your alignment piece. Okay, now we're back on track.
Okay, here's another alignment piece. That one's not as drastic. And we're almost to the end. Okay, and we want to stop right where the pin is. Okay, once we get there, we want to back tack, and then we can cut our thread. So now we're going to press it, and this seam allowance is going to go towards the solid background piece. Get my iron. But doesn't that look gorgeous? Gorgeous! It is tedious, indeed. It is tedious, but so worth the end result. Let's get the quilt rotated to the right, because I'm going to work clockwise on this. And here's the piece that's going to be joined to it, like this. You see how this is much fatter? The first thing I need to do is cut this piece and the piece at the other end down to 9/16. Exactly what we just did is what we're going to do again. The only thing we need to do is, because we have this piece on, we need to pin it out of the way. So I'm going to pin it like this. That keeps this out of my line of stitching and exposes what I need exposed to pin onto here. So my mark is going to be right next to where I already have it. So I don't really need to put a mark here, but I do need to put a mark here, and I'm going to put it on the back side again. Should be right next to where the other piece is on. I'm going to stick a pin across that, and that's where I'm going to want to start my stitches. I'm going to rotate my quilt so that I can start pinning across. And like the last time, I don't know how it's going to end at the far end, and that's why I'm pinning it. I want it to be, whatever that difference is, I want it to be accurate. So I'm not just eyeballing it or laying it on top. I'm pinning it just the way I'm going to stitch it. So you want the bottom to be flat, and you want the lattice to lay flatly on top of it. No tension, no wrinkles, just flat. In this case, we're a little bit short. So if I were to mark my corner here, it's about a half of an inch, 3/8 of an inch to half of an inch short here. Now, here's where we get to something different. This width for one segment, including the background piece, because you have to have that background piece there, is just short of 3 inches, almost right at 3 inches. I don't want to have to add an entire 3-inch piece onto this to get to a half an inch. So here's where I'm going to use the ease in both the fabric and the seams to get here. If it is an inch or less, try to use the ease. If it's more than 2 inches difference here, then you need to add another piece and then shrink it down, which we just did on the top piece. From this end now, I'm going to start laying it out with no tension. And I want to give myself maybe 2 pins with no tension. From here, I'm going to start making adjustments in my pins until it is flat. All right, so we are at the corner here. I'm double checking that the first piece that I sewed on is out of the way. I'm going to use the hand wheel to get my needle exactly where I want it. Take this first pin out, and we're going to stitch 2 or 3 stitches forward. Oop, I gotta put my presser foot down. Man. 2 or 3 stitches forward and the same number backward. I'm going to speed this up for the sewing part. It's the same as putting on that first edge. I'll slow it back down
When we get to the end, we're going to stop it the same way we did the first edge, and then our subsequent pieces 2 and 3, or the side and the top pieces of lattice, are going to go on the exact same way. So if you need to slow this down, you can do that in the settings for YouTube, but I'm just going to let it go fast in case you are tired of seeing that. The end. Remember, this cross pin is where we're going to stop. Just going to creep up on it. I'm going to take that out, and then I'm going to back tack. Let's cut. So I got to take my pins out. My iron is hot because we're going to iron this once we get our pins out. And then I like to go ahead and sew my mitered corners as I work my way around the quilt. I don't know. It might just be seeing the corner done is motivation to help me keep going and not be like, I don't want to adjust this anymore. But it's so worth it, I promise you. You should be so proud of yourself once you get this on and your miters are awesome, and it'll be nice. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to fold this over so that these edges and these points meet. I'm going to put a little pin in right here to start. So these edges, these points, these edges meet, and I'm going to give it a little shake out so that this corner can fold easily. Now, in addition to being out here, I have this part that I want to nest. So this is a temporary thing. I'm going to fold the bottom part to the left so that it can nest with this seam on the top, like this. I know it looks crazy. I know it looks crazy. But then I'm going to put a pin in down this seam, like this, so that this is lined up, these are lined up, this is lined up. Then I want to feel and make sure that these edges, because they're in the same direction, they're not going to nest. I want to make sure that they are lined up as well. And that's when I'm going to put my last pins in, lining up these two edges where the stitch line is. You can feel where the seam allowance is folded over. And I'm going to go ahead and repin this right in that as well. So it's a lot of pins in this corner, but I am now ready to sew. Okay, so I sewed this without recording it, so I'm just going to simulate sewing it again just so you see. I have my stitch line coming in here. I want to use the hand wheel to put my needle down right as that comes in at a 1/4 inch mark. Then I want to lower my presser foot, and then I want to slowly and carefully sew 2 or 3 stitches forward, then the same number back, and then carefully sew this till I get to the end, and then I want to back tag. Let's go see how it looks. So it's a little fat here, but I think it's fine. I think it's fine. So this is what the back looks like. And you can open it. You don't have to open it. It makes the seam a little less noticeable. I'm so happy about this. I could go back in and tighten this up down near the point, but I think I'm going to leave it. I think this is a handmade item. So we'll be adding one more border to the outside of this before we add the top and bottom borders, but I'm going to continue. I've got 2 more sides to sew onto this quilt, and then we'll be able to add our next borders. Okay, so I'm about to sew the 3rd piece on. I'm not going to show you all the pinning and all that stuff because you already seen it, but I did want to show you that because we added a piece to the bottom, which was the opposite side of this, I know I'm going to need to add a piece to this, so I'm going to go ahead and add it. And because I added the first one on incorrectly, I wanted to show you how to add it on correctly. I want to look at the back side of my existing strip. This is the piece that I'm going to add, and I want to make sure that it's oriented the same way before I decide which side of the background piece I want to remove.
Now I have not trimmed to the end yet, so I could have just added this on to the end. But I've already accounted for how my corners are going to come together. And so by adding it in the middle, I don't have to do any readjustments at the ends. Seriously, when you get this border done, you deserve a glass of wine or a beer, whatever it is, or a root beer, whatever it is that you would like to celebrate. Personally, I'm a huge fan of sparkling apple cider. That's what I drink when I want to be fancy, out of a wine glass or a champagne glass. You have all the information you need to get this part of the quilt done, so I will see you for the next part. So I have my borders, my lattice sewn onto my quilt all the way around. The next thing I need to do is I need to sew a second inside border, or a second inside border. This border I need to sew again to the outside of the long edges of the quilt. And I already have my pieces put together, ready to sew on, but as you see, I'm having a hard time pulling this apart. The reason is because I have pinned this whole long edge together so that I can make a real-time assessment. Real-time assessment, that's not the word I want to use. But what I want to do is I want to make sure that my two long edges are the same length. So I started up here and I pinned all the way down to here, and you see that here at the bottom it's not quite the same. Not quite the same. Also, this corner didn't turn out as perfectly as I wanted, but the width here is 3 inches, the width here is 3 inches, and I just must have sewn it weird, and I don't want to cut it because I don't want to skew the rest of the quilt. So as long as the measurements work out, if this corner isn't fully in the corner, I would say leave it alone. All right. But as far as my length goes, I have one side that's a little bit longer than the other, but I don't think it's actually longer. Now that I'm looking at it, I think that this bottom edge is not quite square. So let me get a square ruler and we will give that a check. I'll just use this one. So this ruler here is the one that I used when I was measuring some other things. So it looks like this bottom piece, this piece is not quite square. So I'm going to check it. And the way I'm going to check it is, remember we cut, you see that? Yes. Remember that we cut these lattice pieces to 3 inches. It's sewn on, so from the stitch line to the end should be 2 3/4, because a 1/4 inch is lost to the seam allowance. So what I want to do is I want to put my ruler on. I want to put the one, I gotta take another pin out, it's in my way. So I want to measure from this seam out 2 3/4 this way and 2 3/4 this way. So I'm going to take my 2 3/4 and I'm going to put that where that intersection is, right on the point of this border. 2 3/4 and 2 3/4, and then I'm going to make sure that the 2 3/4 line is down this edge, that I am squaring this all out. And the way this gets out of whack is just you know, my seam allowance, my stitch line I'm a wobbly stitcher, and so sometimes you can get corners that are not quite square. Let's check this side as well. There's a little bit of a wobble out there. So I will say, and I should have done this already, I'm just starting fresh for the morning and didn't realize I didn't do it last night, is make sure that your corners are squared up. So let's flip this over so we can get the other corner. I don't want to unpin all of my pinning if I don't have to. So here's my square ruler, and again I'm going to measure 2 3/4 and 2 3/4. I'm going to line it up against the outside of that border. And this side looks like it's a little short in the corner. So, you know, I'm going to keep that in mind that not all of my corners are completely square. This is correct where it's bowed out here, but then I lose a little bit in the corner. So doesn't seem like a ironing issue. It's about 1/8 of an inch, so I'll need to compensate for that when I put these other pieces on. So that's those two corners. Let's check the opposite two corners. Right here. And this feels like it's pulled to the right a little bit. So let me see here which of these corners is short. They're okay. The reason I'm doing all of this squaring up and matching up corners is because I want to make sure that I keep this quilt square, and the lattice is very flexible. So you could end up with a wavy edge on the outside if it is too long. So you just want to make sure that everything lays flat and that these two are the same. Then you're going to measure these pieces against your quilt, and then you're going to pin it on first so that you make sure if you have to make any adjustments to that length that it ends up being the same. Okay, that's very important because all of these seams have a lot of flexibility in there. So you could end up accidentally stretching one side or stretching both sides and then getting what amounts to a ruffle beyond this edge. Okay, so be very careful. Make sure that both long edges are the same length and that the border pieces that you add on there are the same length, and then cut them to the precise size, then pin them onto the quilt before you sew them on so that everything stays equal and square. Okay, this one is going to be even harder than this one. This one had a little stretch in it because of the piecing, but this one has a lot of stretch in it, and that's why we're putting these borders on to stabilize the quilt between borders. All right, so we're getting our square ruler again. We're putting down 2 3/4 and 2 3/4 on these border lines. And whew, something's weird. Let's get that squared up. All right, so it looks like this side might be a little short here. So we're going to leave that, and let's check, make sure nothing was weird in our layout here. So this is an aware. Got one more pin right here, and I really want to make sure that it matches up. So I've got a pin right there. So all the way down the edge, I'm going to put my pins back in here. We've got things matched up. And most of my pins are out of the way, like I've got these pins back like this so that I can actually pin these pieces on without taking this apart. So I'm feeling for any like wonkiness in here. And as I'm laying these pieces on to measure, I just want to make sure everything's laying flat. So I have enough, more than enough, for each edge, and I'm going to fold this in half. With the wrong sides together is how I want to fold this. Now it might be a little twisted. I'm not going to worry too much about that. Hopefully it's not so twisted that I can't work it out at the end. So wrong sides together for this. I'm going to make sure that both of these edges are the same by just lining it up and giving it a little cut to make sure that they're perpendicular to the length. And just the way my table is set up, let's put a pin in here real quick, keep these ends together. I think it's going to be easier for me to start on the left hand side of the quilt, of the long edge of the quilt. And here's how I'm going to pin this together. You don't have to do it this way. You can do it however it works for you. Just keep in mind that there's a lot of maneuverability in this lattice border, and you need to keep your edges the same length. Okay? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to move this pin. These pins that I just put in, I put in close. And I don't want to do that. All right. So what I want to do now is I'm going to fold this back so I can see both sides. My quilt is still pinned together way back here so that I have room to get in here and pin my border on. So my border, I want to line up with the edge, and I'm going to stick my pin in this bottom piece. So I'm going to have that bottom border pinned on, and I'm going to pin this border on here as well. So I'm going to pin it like this because I do want to manage my seam allowances as I'm sewing this on. I'm going to put a pin right here on the back side. And then I'm going to take this pin out and I'm going to put these two sides back together and keep this edge lined up. You don't have to do it this way. This is just how I'm going to tackle this. All right, so I have the start of my borders pinned inside, and now I'm just going to travel down and alternate between the two sides, pinning out of the path of my presser foot, but pinning the border onto my lattice. I need one more pin on the other side there. So my pins are like this, my pins are like this. Because I have put my wrong sides together before I stuck it in here, they're in the right position to be sewn on. And I'm just going to go down both sides like this. And this is going to help me to make sure that they're both the same width. So I'm kind of doing everything at once instead of measuring both sides, doing the math, cutting these to size, and hoping that I decided for the right way in terms of how to make my adjustment. Okay, wrong sides together. Make sure everything is flat. Speeding it back up, I thought we could just voice over this part. It's pretty straightforward, just the way we added or measured and added the borders that are inside the lattice. We're measuring and adding the borders that are outside the lattice. So what I should be putting on right now are the two side pieces, and I'm just pinning them like I did before, except I'm doing it simultaneously on both sides and getting equal measures for the lattice on each side. I mean, for the outside border on each side. Unfortunately, what I had actually pinned was the top and bottom lattices. So what you'll see me do is I did not have the heart to pick this out. I just leave the top and bottom on, then add the sides that are supposed to be on, and then I adjust the thick second borders that are at the top and bottom so that I have
the same measurement as I did on the rainbow quilt. So I'm just demonstrating it looks correct, and if I didn't tell you I did it wrong, you wouldn't know I did it wrong, but I did it wrong. And I was so happy because I was playing Bob and Chicken this whole time, and we're about to celebrate together. Not tacking. We made it! So if you will turn to page 26 in version 2, we are finally on to the last borders. So we're starting with those same K pieces that we had a lot of extra because you get more K pieces than you do M pieces when you're doing the lattice. And we're going to kind of separate this into 3 different groups, which is one group that has the background piece on both sides, one group that has the background piece on one side, and a group that has no background pieces. So you see there, those are we'll call them class 2 and class 0, to make what I call chiclets, which are just the small squares that are going to be horizontal in the top and bottom borders. If you have 2 pieces on each side, just cut a piece with no background and put it in between. Other than that, while you're cutting extra pieces, if you need more pieces, just sew the background piece to one side, and that will make it easier for you to just sew a bunch together until you get enough to span the width of the quilt. Also, something to consider if you're using directional fabric, the squares are going to be, if you cut a long strip like this, the top will be a long side and not a short side. So you may want to cut those squares individually and then sew background pieces onto the left or right side. I hope that makes sense. The orientation is different than what it was in the lattice pieces. So here I am with the additional K sections. Are they K sections? I believe so. It's K and M. Yeah, with the additional K sections that I just cut, and I'm just sewing an L piece, that 10-inch by 1 1/8 inch piece background fabric to one side of each of them. I'm pressing the seam allowances all towards the background piece, and then I'm taking another K piece and sewing it to the other side. The reason I'm doing this is because I have a ton of those pieces that have 2 background pieces on each side, and that way I can put these pairs with a single piece of background fabric between all those extra pieces that I have with 2 pieces of background fabric. In all cases, for this second border, seam allowances are going to go towards the background fabric. Once I get a few of these set up, then I'm gonna cut them like I had before. They're the same size as they were in the lattice, which is that 1 3/4 inch. So I'm just gonna give myself a 0 here, and then I'll cut as many 1 3/4 inch pieces as I can. I used a piece of tape on my ruler so that I could get these cuts out quickly. It's just taped on the bottom of the ruler at 1 3/4. And I get as many as I can out of those pieces, and then I just start sewing them together, and I want to use the same rules basically that I did in the lattice. I want to make 2 simultaneously and make sure that I get good distributions of the fabrics I have remaining. So I just spread as many as I can out, and then I start sewing them together. And I just eyeball the width. I think I do have a number in the pattern for the number of squares that you're going to need, but again, there are so many seams here, you may not get one that's exactly the width that you need it to be, or with that number of chiclets. Once you have the right width, you're going to give everything a good press. Make sure that your seam allowances are towards the background piece, and you want to add a final background piece on the opposite end of your strip of chiclets. Then you want to pin that to your thicker strip of fabric, which is going to be a P. It should be cut to 5 inches, but again, I made an error, and this is the difference between 5 inches and what I already have sewn onto the quilt, but yours should be 5 inches if you want this thickness. And it took roughly two pieces of fabric, selvage to selvage, to make each thick border. Then you're going to make your thin border, which is piece J, and that is going to measure 1 5/8 inches cut. And once you get this sewn on, you will sew the 1 5/8 inch piece to the opposite side of your strip of chiclets. Be careful not to stretch anything. And then you're going to press all your seam allowances towards the background pieces, so out away from your strip of chiclets. And then you'll sew them onto the quilt, which I will demonstrate, except the thick part of the top and bottom border should be towards the center of the quilt, not the way I accidentally sew it on, as you will see. But we are nearing the end. Stick with me. Almost done.
Okay, we're almost done. I already have one of these done, and this one came together pretty easily without me needing to really adjust my chiclets any, but my other one is not coming together as easily, and I wanted to show you how to adjust that. So on this one, I have pinned from each end. These background pieces are trimmed to the 7/8 of an inch beyond the seam line on both sides, and I have them lined up and pinned. And I pinned until I got to about here, and I have a little bit too much for the excuse me, I have the hiccups. I ate way too much today. For the amount of chiclets that I have, but I want them to end evenly, right? So I'm going to basically do the same thing I did with the lattice pieces, but it's easier because our pieces are 90 degrees from our stitch line. And every time I make a fatter seam allowance, it's going to actually take double what that is. When you're on the diagonal, it's a little bit different than double, a little bit more than double, but this time it's going to be double. So if I move my stitch line in 1/8 of an inch, I'm going to lose 1/4 of an inch. So I have a pin here and I have a pin here. That's where I stop my pinning. So I'm just going to kind of squeeze this together and see how much I have to lose. And it looks like about a little less than 1/4 of an inch on standing up here. So I would double that and say a little less than 1/2 of an inch is what I need to make up for. And so I'm just going to pinch these. Actually, what I could do is I could take them apart and re-sew them so that my background pieces keep the same size, but because I'm only taking a little bit, I'm not that worried about it. I'm just going to pinch two pieces. So if I sew in 1/8 of an inch here, this is going to take about 1/4 of an inch. And if I sew 1/8 of an inch in here, that's going to take about 1/4 of an inch. So if I take both of these in 1/8 of an inch, then I'm going to be taking out about 1/2 of an inch, because it's 1/8 of an inch times 2 here, which is 1/4 of an inch, and 1/8 of an inch times 2 here, which is another 1/4 of an inch, which is 1/2 an inch. And I know that I don't actually need to take that much out, I don't think. So I'm going to sew these a little less than 1/8 of an inch. All right, so I'm keeping my chiclets pinned to my thick background, and we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. But here's my first one. Just kind of fold it. Take out my pin because I just had that pin there to mark it. Make sure that my edges at the top and the bottom are aligned so that I get another straight seam. And we're going to stitch about 1/8 of an inch away, a little less. Okay, and here's my second pin marking where I want to take a little bit out. We're going to do the same thing, about 1/8 of an inch in. Now we're going to press that flat and see how it lays. Okay, and I can look on this side and just see where I have the largest gap. And that gets me back. Look at that. I can already tell that that is pretty good. So I'm going to finger press there, finger press there. Then I'm going to iron. And I might need to take one more piece. So when I lay this down, it's still a little bit more than I want there. So I'm going to pinch one more spot, which I think is right here. And I'm going to take one more little bit out. So I'll do it on this side so you can see my stitches. And this is kind of a wonky seam that I sewed here anyway, so this is an opportunity to fix that as well. It looks really weird. Okay, so we're going to take about 1/8 of an inch there and simultaneously straighten it out. Okay, we'll give this a press towards the seam allowance. Lay this flat again, and now it's looking good. Now it's looking like it's going to fit. I'll actually press this with my iron. And so that you can see how that looks. So here's a correction, and I should have one more here. 2. Here's a correction. So that's where they are. And now, when this is flat, looks like it fits. So we're going to pin this down the rest of the way, and then we'll sew it onto this large piece. Rotate this around so all my pins are going in the same direction. Hold on. Did I make it too tight? No, it's just the way it was laying. Make sure that you line these edges up. And I like to stick my pins in away from my stitch line so they don't have to remove them. I am going to back tack it. And then I just want to control the direction of my seam allowances. You have a lot of options here, but I wanted to do this the way it is done in the pattern with one caveat. When I sewed the inner borders onto the quilt, I sewed the top and I sewed the first borders to the lattice correctly. Top, bottom, left, right. Then I sewed the lattice in, and then I was supposed to sew the left and right borders for the last border around the lattice, and I accidentally sewed on the top and bottom. So instead of picking all of that out, I just sewed on the left and right that I was supposed to, leaving the top and bottom on. That was supposed to be on here. And if I was just working on a quilt, you know, just randomly for myself, I would have just made an adjustment to the border, changed it up, and kept driving on. But because I want it to look the same as the pattern, what I did was let me show you here. So I still need to put the short border on here, and then it will look just like this one. I do recommend that you pin that piece on so that these lay flat. Otherwise, there may be a tendency to stretch this and then give yourself a wavy top. So pin this on, even if you leave a little extra on the ends, which is what I tend to do for this one. And then I have some extra corner there for squaring up after I quilt the quilt, because sometimes those corners kind of draw in on you. So I just left myself a little extra there. So I will sew a piece on here as well. But let me show you the quilt center. So, I actually sewed the piece on the top and the bottom, and so I just left it on. And I did the math for the difference because this was a 1 5/8 inch piece, and the piece that's supposed to go here after this is on is a 5-inch cut piece, so it finished at 4.5. So I did the math, and in case you make the same mistake, if you want it to look the same as the quilt that you already made, instead of maybe just sewing this on top and putting these together this way, I took the difference and added it to what was already sewn on so that it would still be the 4.5 inches finished when I get it attached. All right, so that math is if you accidentally sew to the top and bottom, or if you want to sew to the top and bottom to just stabilize this lattice before you add another border on, and you want to keep the same dimensions, this cut piece now will be 3 7/8 inches cut. That would make it 3 3/8 inches finished, plus this 1 1/8 finished will give you the 4.5 inch finished space here that is in the pattern. So you can do whatever you want, of course. And since I have this ready to go, I'm going to fold this in half, give myself a pinch here to mark half, and put a little pin in right at the fold. And lay this down. So just remember, if you're gonna sew this as it is in the pattern, you're not gonna have this piece on. You're gonna have a bigger piece on this border, and then you're gonna be sewing it directly onto the lattice. So let me fold this in half to find the center. Give that a hard pinch. Then I'm going to put this center on the center fold right there. And that should have me all the way centered. And now I'm going to pin out to the edges on both sides, and then we'll sew this on. So I want to get both layers laying flat. And then I'll start pinning. Now you don't have to pin this, but you may not get the same results if you don't. This allows you to preview the sizing and making sure that the borders are the correct size. So I'm going to get my pin here. And then make sure that's laying flat, and it is. It does seem like I have a smidge of tension right here, so I'm just going to repin it. Yeah, that's fine. So now I'm going to go the other way. If your space is like mine and you're like pinning in a small space, make sure that the last pin that you put in is on top of the table and that you're not pinning a curve into your quilt as you pin. So you want to have your last pin on top of the table. Then you can smooth out your layers and get things flat. If it's hanging off the table, there's the curve of the corner and maybe possibly uneven stretching due to gravity off of that side, and that will possibly get you messed up. So make sure that last pin is on top of the table. All right, so this is going to be at the end. These should match up. This part should match up. So it looks like I've got to give it a little bit of tension to make it match. So I'm going to work my way backwards. Smooth it. And then I'm going to remove one pin at a time until all that tension is out. I want to make sure that that stays folded. I'm just going to go back one at a time until there's no more tension between the two layers. That seems pretty good. Let's get that. All right, that looks pretty good. So let's sew this, and then basically that'll be the end of the quilt. I just need to sew the other end on the same way that you're seeing right now. Let's get this sewn on, and that'll be it. And again, one last time, this piece would be sewn like this, except that back tack, except that you'd be sewing directly to this piece instead of to another piece here. Sorry for hitting the camera. This is the hardest camera to sew around. Okay, nothing's pulling. My pins are here. In case you can't see them, I am still pinned. All right, so we'll just take these pins out, give this a spritz, and we'll press this towards the background. In this case, because I have background on both sides, I can press it either way. All right, I think that's all of them. Nope, there's one. So I'm going to give this a spritz. Oh my goodness, I think I sewed this on wrong. I think I sewed this on wrong. I did, because this is the side that was supposed to be sewn to that. But anyway, you see how it needs to be sewn on the quilt, even though I sewed it on the wrong side. So I'm going to go pick this out, and I will sew both sides on the correct way, which is rotated the other way around. And then I will see you at the design wall to close this bad boy out. I'm just going to make this correction. I put it on the wrong way. This side should be here. This side should be there. Ugh, such a long day. All right, I'll see you when this is all done. Right, everything's fixed. Now we're just going to give it a good press, and we can call this quilt top finished. Well, all right, my friends, we are finished with the Scrappy Arabesque quilt. Again, I will have the instructions. Sorry, I will have the pattern linked down below if you're interested in buying it. And I would love to see whatever quilts that you make. Like, it really makes my day. Also, it makes my day would be a like, a subscribe, and I highly recommend the notification bell, because I post videos whenever I finish projects instead of on a regular schedule. So If you're interested in seeing more, I highly recommend the bell. I hope you enjoyed this pair of videos. Each one functions as a standalone. You can use the interior of the quilt to make a standalone quilt and add your own borders, or you could make your own interior and add these borders to your quilt and you'll get something fantastic and unique. I hope you'll leave me some comments down below. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. See you soon.